I'm really nervous, so. Okay. Yes. I can see everything. Cool. Yeah. So what we talk about when we talk about observability frameworks, you probably want to know who I am first, right? So my name is Timothy Mahoney. I'm a senior systems engineer at Ikea Retail. I've been at Ikea for about 2 years now. I think 2 years this month. Before that, I started out as a sysadmin in the late 90s, working with like BSDOS and weird things like that. I ended up with a long career in satellite communications. I managed a satellite teleport in southern Sweden for about 16 years. Did a lot of work with Nagios and Zabbix and Cacti and trying to correlate data between the satellite system's proprietary stuff and the things I could scrape together with open source tools. Then when that job finished, I spent about 3 years working as a Splunk consultant. My colleague Robert Johansson and I did an integration with Splunk and GCP, deploying like Splunk into GCP for Ikea. Made a presentation for the Stockholm Splunk users group using Ren and Stimpy and World of Tanks graphics called the Splunk Dirt Gun. That helped me get a job at Ikea, where I ended up in the observability pipeline team, where I work now. I'm originally from Michigan. I've been living in Sweden for about 22 years. My wife and son and our dog are here in America over the summer visiting family. Click. Not clicking. Okay. So yeah, I tried to be clever with the title. The idea came when we had this discussion where we're trying to build an observability framework for Ikea. The framework itself is probably not really interesting outside of Ikea because it's Ikea specific. It's Conway's Law, but the process and the discussions around it as we created it, I thought were very interesting. The title comes from a book by Haruki Murakami. It's called What We Talk About When We Talk About Running. The book's about running marathons. I found out after I submitted the talk and did my research that it's actually an homage to a book called What We Talk About when we talk about love. So this presentation could really be what we talk about when we love observability and we need to create an observability framework. So the goal that we were given in the pipeline team is to create an observability framework. We had some ADRs that our senior engineering team had come up with. We needed to provide a framework as guidance for the many engineers at Ikea that respects developer freedom, reflects our company values, and encourages adoption. So we were tasked with moving our ADRs from the draft stage to accepted and then encourage the adoption of this framework. The challenge here is that we weren't given the mandate to enforce it. So we had to convince people to use the framework. And I really questioned that whole process when we did it up until I created this presentation. And then I kind of understood why we did things that way. So we started out with the contributors, the people that really helped us get our framework in order. I'm really fortunate. I work on a team of really talented people. We have people with a bunch of different backgrounds in programming, in DevOps, in testing. So we have a lot of great influences and we have really good conversation. We also have people in operational intelligence where I work that run some of our tools like our application performance monitoring tools and our log analytics people. They're also very vocal, very, very conversive, and we set up the ability for us to communicate what our needs are for this framework to be successful. And I lost my notes. Yeah, so we also have engineers in the teams at Ikea that are really keen to share their knowledge and to place demands on us. So we have the outlet for that as well. They share their knowledge, their experience, and their frustrations with us. It builds a good dialogue. And beyond that, we've really had a great benefit from events like Monitorama, from people's podcasts online, like OllieCast, like people sharing experiences that we wouldn't have gained just by trying to be a self-contained team and to build a framework on our own. Then we have the detractors. We're given this great opportunity. We're going to build an observability framework. The caveat is that we have to advocate for the adoption. being enthusiastically naive, I was sure that the time and effort that we put into this was going to be like greatly appreciated and celebrated far and wide. It didn't take me too long to discover that not everyone is so terribly enthusiastic about what we were trying to do. Questions I would see turn up in our Slack channel, and the answer would be like a single dumpster fire emoji. I get that engineers are busy people. I know they don't have the time or the energy or the empathy to always answer every question that pops up. But when you have special interest channels, I think it's important to be engaging. It's part of our company culture. But it made me really frustrated and angry, especially trying to build an observability framework. The effect is contagious. If an engineer who's really respected puts out a single emoji response, people follow through and just assume that whatever that case was has been dismissed. And I'm really willing to accept criticism when we do things like a framework or a project, and I really don't appreciate empty criticism. So this is the enemy of our project to do an observability framework. The disclaimer here is that this isn't indicative of Ikea work culture at all. I mean, this is like single instances where people didn't respond to what I thought was an important question in a way I thought was appropriate. But this is what we were trying to avoid. This goes against company culture and company values, but I really didn't want to create a framework that would be dismissed in an emoji. So we had to do the groundwork for laying up this framework for the different teams. We really wanted to reduce the cognitive overload on these teams when we present this stuff to them. Not everybody does observability in their projects. We want to present it as something great and new that they can do, but we don't want to give them the fire hose of information we can dump on them about how to do metrics, logs, and tracing and everything that goes around it. Nobody wants to read your 50-page document on logs. Nobody wants you to sit up and talk for 2.5 hours on how to do tracing. I've done that. People said, we liked your lab on tracing, but we don't remember a word you said for 2 hours. Yeah, and we didn't want to produce documentation or technical things that we couldn't maintain. I mean, we're not a huge team of people. There's like 5 or 6 people on my team, and we don't have all the time in the world to sit and maintain the documentation. So we needed to be constructively lazy. So after the run-in with the cult of the dumpster fire emoji, my imposter syndrome was starting to tingle. We had internal discussions with other teams about what we wanted to do, how we were going to build this framework, and I started to notice that people in my team, people in other teams, they're reflexively using terms, and they don't necessarily jive with the meaning of the terms. So we started to get a little panicked. People are using like data model and framework interchangeably, and they don't necessarily have the same meaning. And we had our ADRs and the components of our framework, but we really didn't know how they related to each other. So we had these architectural decisions about what the data model needed to have in it, how the data was going to be transported, that we were going to go all in on OpenTelemetry, but we didn't really understand what that meant in terms of what is a framework, what is a data model, what is a standard, what are the components, and how do we relate them to each other. So that was a big eye-opener. Yeah, we're not really going to inspire confidence in the other teams if we don't know what we're talking about, especially if we're just mixing up nouns in the process. So, we don't inspire confidence with that. It's really important that we weren't afraid to ask the trivial questions, though, and assume the understanding of concepts. It's really easy that, yeah, I know what a framework is. Sure, I've used one, but I've never made one, and I don't know all the answers. So as we go through this process of like figuring out and doing the big Venn diagram of putting all the pieces where we think they belonged and trying to explain it to each other and to other teams what the ADRs were supposed to mean and how they related to OpenTelemetry and how they related to what Ikea needed to do, we needed to look at like, were we really understood when we were creating these documents, that we were trying to keep the documentation load down, we're trying to create something clear and concise. Ikea is a big company. Not everyone is a native English speaker. I'm the only native English speaker in our team. It doesn't mean that we don't converse in English, but it does mean that the understanding can be kind of mixed. Oftentimes the colleagues will ask me like, oh, I wrote this, can you read it over and make sure that what I wrote makes sense to you in English? So it's not always so easy. Language is hard. So as a good example of this, like when my son was born, we went to the doctor with him in Sweden. I speak fluent Swedish. I've been in Sweden a really long time. But he was like, he looked at me and he looked at my son and he said, "Oh, you're far upp I dagen." And I had no idea what that meant. It meant like dad up in the day. And he kept telling me this and I'm like, I have no idea what you're saying to me. Why are you telling me this? So it's really easy that the language that we think that will be easily understood by the people consuming this framework and the documentation around it is like completely misunderstood, because from their perspective, they have an understanding of English as a business language, but maybe not the context of what we're trying to convey. The other issue that we found in being understood was that sometimes people would assume that vocabulary means authority. So you would create documentation, you would get some document from somebody that they want to add in, and they would write like the most complicated English possible and super long run-on sentences, and then expect that some engineer is going to read all of that and understand it. I don't think that's a really good way to do a documentation that everyone's supposed to adhere to. Creating confusion at that level is a terrible idea. So we tried to scale back. We tried to make it as easily understandable as possible. Like try to cut down on the expensive words and make it good. And we really started to think like we really need to use modal verbs for things. When we tell people that this is a framework that you need to do to adhere to that framework, even if we don't have the mandate to force you to, we have to use words like should not, must, and may, and we have to be really clear about what that means logically to them when they're going through that framework. And again, the dumpster fire emoji people are just waiting to read that and trash it. So we had to be really careful in the language we chose. Then we really had to talk about like how do we collaborate and where do we collaborate. This kind of seems obvious after the fact, but like we have tools for creating documentations like Confluence, static documentation, stuff about teams, stuff like that, and then you have the documentation that you've checked into Git. And we had to be really clear about like where do we publish the stuff and what is it important. If it's something like the framework, it has to be something that people can create issues for or do pull requests on. We want that collaboration, but lots of teams are looking for this documentation in Confluence because there's not necessarily a clear path for them to find it. So we really had to make sure that we had that sync between Git and Confluence for that data, and we had to make sure that people understood that, yeah, if you take issue with this framework, if there's something about it you don't understand, where do you reach out? How do you create a pull request? How do you create an issue? And then also have that available so when people do have ideas, that they know where to do it, or they know how to look and see if that's already been suggested. The other thing we had to be really careful with was semantic versioning on the framework, because we want people to consume it. We know they're going to consume parts of it programmatically. We want to make sure that they know that there's been a change to it and why and what level of change that is. And we really have to keep managers from getting involved and labeling everything 2.0 and doing all sorts of buzzword bingo and thinking that that's going to create better understanding. And it's not clicking. So yeah, so the framework itself seems pretty obvious. It's a structure you're building software on. Our goal here, we needed to pave a path for engineers to ensure observability data generated in their system can be transmitted and consumed anywhere. The role of the framework is to provide straightforward means to accomplish this and ensure the data produced by the systems is consistent and correlatable. I mean, that's pretty standard stuff. What really helped here was OpenTelemetry. I know we all like throw this around all the time and we have the collector and we do all this great stuff. I think we're kind of missing the point that the underlying work on the collector, the protocol, the data models and stuff is fantastic. I mean, I don't even know how to tell you my appreciation for how well done that is. When we were looking at creating our framework, we have these data models and things. We're trying to be constructively lazy. We don't want to create everything from scratch. And here we have this super well documented, fantastic, losing the word here, specification and data model to fall back on. So we can build upon that. I can't imagine trying to do an observability framework and not having OpenTelemetry as a core component of that. So any of you that are maintainers or contributors to that in OpenTelemetry, like seriously, thank you very much. So now we have OpenTelemetry, we have a data model, we have all this stuff. The big question for us is like, what's the minimum viable set of attributes for an atomic unit of observability? This is Ikea specific things, right? We need to motivate teams to include the attributes to their telemetry to provide that value to the business. The attributes ensure that the data ownership as well as allow the observability data to be consumed between teams. We're trying to like de-silo teams and make them understand that like, yeah, you're solving your technical issue, but there's value to the rest of the organization for this stuff. Like, you know, it's easy to lose perspective, you know, instrumenting for an application and forgetting that we sell furniture. So it's really important that we build these core attributes, and we do it in a way that doesn't create a lot of extra cardinality, for example. And in the system, we don't want it to be a super costly thing to do. I think I heard some story once about Google adding attributes to Gmail that cost like a small fortune. And obviously that's not something we want to do, but we want to make sure that for the organization level, we understand what that data is. We have the idea who owns it. The other challenge isn't necessarily adding the attributes to the OpenTelemetry data, because that's very straightforward, it's well documented. It's how the tooling will accept that data. I mean, you could say like, I'm going to add an environment variable, I'm going to call something an environment, and then you'll find out in the tooling they've already used that. So we had a lot of work to do in communicating with our teams, making sure they understood that the attributes that we wanted to deploy that were specific to our business, like didn't crash with the attributes that the tooling was already using. We even ran into, like, we built half of the framework and we got confused about which one we were using. Were we using camel case or snake case? So the data model, you know, yeah, so what was I going to say about this? Yeah, so we had, our data model is basically an extension. What we ended up with was this extending what was already provided by OpenTelemetry to have these. So our instructions were definitely like, you know, we're creating attributes. We want it to be that it should be possible to use unambiguously the data within our organization. It should be possible to correlate between dependent services. With the attributes we added, the data must allow ownership of the data to be determined. I mean, that's a really big problem. You have a system like Splunk, you have a system like Grafana, people are ingesting data into your system. You want to know who owns it, and you can't always trust like that they ingested it with a token, and that token means that's the team that did it. I mean, some teams trade tokens around like Pokemon cards. You also want that the data should be easy to use with machine learning and automation. So like outside of the context of them just doing performance monitoring or troubleshooting a problem, some of that data is going to provide value later on. It needs to be created in a consistent manner. So standards was an issue, so that we were tasked with giving out what the standards were, and CNCF is not a standards organization. They're not defining the size of the weight of a kilogram. But what we ended up doing was we said that our observability standard is an extension of the common industry specifications. Those specifications happen to come mostly from OpenTelemetry. We want that they should use OpenTelemetry, but we weren't mandating that everything use OpenTelemetry. That it's a little unrealistic. But we wanted to make sure that things that can and do use OpenTelemetry, they emit things with OTLP, that people aren't trying to use the collector or fooled into thinking that collector is like a Babel fish that's just going to translate all the different telemetry protocols back and forth. And we also wanted to say that, like, okay, if you have a product that can't emit OpenTelemetry, then you have to make sure that you at least get the data model in on an ingest, so we can determine business use case for it, who owns this data, where did it come from. Yeah, so components were the last part of it, right? So you have the OpenTelemetry specific components, you have the collector, you have all the pieces that you can get directly from them, instrumentation libraries, the collector, the contrib, the Helm charts, the operator. And then the only part that we had to do to limit the amount of technical debt that we carried is we do collector configurations specifically for Ikea that have the attributes in them or can have the attributes. We have processor stuff and integration with other tools like Backstage. So that leads into examples. So we have, you have to give these teams technical examples for them to be able to follow. A lot of times that's what we get for our requests now, that we want people to adopt our framework, and the first thing there is like, how do I do this with what I have now? So I want examples that I can copy paste in. So we create our own examples they should get a best practice example with our framework attributes already in place. So it's really important for us, like documentation load-wise, that we can point to articles on Medium or examples in repos and what we think is like best practice for what they want to do or what we expect them to do. But at the same time, we provide examples that show how we've implemented our framework correctly. We obviously want like the least amount of effort or cognitive load on the teams. So the fun part, this is the part of my job that I really enjoy, is demos and labs. So Ikea has this program called Native Clouders that they started about a year and a half ago, where we take engineers out of teams, and at the time when I did it, was 6 weeks or more. It's an intensive training in GCP, and it was a really cool eye-opener that you work with all these different engineers from all these different teams. Definitely like imposter syndrome problem the first week or two, until everyone realized that everyone has some small part to play, and there's no one person who had all the answers. But we as a team, in the pipeline team, we created demos and labs. As part of that Native Clouders program, we had a lab on tracing. Now we've done some other labs on SLOs and stuff, and it's a really good way to advocate for the framework, is advocate that people should do good observability and help our engineers. Like we really have to convince teams like why should they spend the time and effort implementing the framework when they don't see the value inherently in it. So we try to teach them not to be bashful with their observability data, and we want to expose teams to the framework as soon as possible and build it into their way of working. And I think the labs are a great way to do that, because the engineers that come back from programs like the Native Clouders, they've already seen how to instrument code, and they've already seen the framework in action, and they understand what it's for. I think it's an excellent means of exchanging ideas and challenges as well. Since we were involved in that program, we could see what the other labs were doing. We could see where people were doing like test-driven design. How are they doing that? How could we contribute with observability? And mostly we just want to show them that we're reasonable people. Yeah, so that is it. I think the big takeaways, if you're going to do an observability framework, make the framework something teams want to adopt. That was the part I didn't understand when we were given this task and told it wasn't like a mandated thing that everyone had to do it. We're going to create this framework and you must do it. And it turned out that we had to advocate for it. And now we have like teams and managers saying that they're going to do observability and that the framework is the right way to do it. They willingly, they're willingly taking on the task of doing it and allocating the time to implement it properly, instead of us like just forcing it upon them. You definitely want to ensure that your consumers are invested in collaboration. I think that's really tricky when you come in a company and you come with a new idea. Like, how do you get people to contribute back to you? And don't present your case in a way that can be easily dismissed in an emoji. I think it's really important. And yeah, be constructively lazy. And that's all I have.
Apparently I learned that the thumbs up emoji is passive aggressive for the Zoomers. And so now I just keep aggressively doing it to my own kids. But I don't think they've realized that like the salute one too, which I feel like kind of came out of Twitter, is also pretty passive aggressive. Like,
oh man.
So I also...
I think the dumpster fire emoji is directly aggressive.
All right. Any questions? Any questions from the audience?
We're keeping them in coffee donuts.
Yeah. Okay. We're gonna go with outside in.
Hi. Did you have access to any? Did you study or have access to any mentorship on formal product management methodologies for selling your framework internally, or did you kind of have to just figure that out on your own?
So we totally just winged it.
Yeah, so the question was, did you have like access to any product management methodologies or anything to sell this? Yeah.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so basically just like product management. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, right here.
Multi-partner. How did you track adoption? How did you track sentiment? And what was your team evaluated on for success?
So how did you track? Well, man, there was a lot there.
Sorry. How did you track sentiment and adoption?
Sentiment adoption. How did you track sentiment adoption? And then what were you like? What was the team kind of graded on for measures of success?
Oh, okay, so it's still ongoing, so I don't know what the metrics are for that. That's my manager's question. but it is tricky to try and do it. We have an attribute that says the framework in it, so the data that gets emitted by applications that have been instrumented with the framework will show the framework version that they're adhering to. So that's one way in the data that we can see. So in our tools, we see that come up. And we also kind of like, cruise through their GitHub repos and see what's going on and see people are deviating from it as well. See people, make sure that they're doing good observability and that they don't reinvent the wheel just because they didn't know that we existed or that they weren't aware that we could help them.
Yeah, I actually really like the idea of like trolling through their code itself. So in the back there.
Actually, following on from that, if you find people mirroring, do you try to engage with them to see if it's like a pattern that you would adopt in the framework, or is it usually like a, hey, did you know, and redirect them toward what you want?
Yeah, so how did you basically like veer people into it if they were maybe resisting the frameworks?
It's perfectly within their right to not adhere at the moment. It's a higher level management that tells people that they have to adhere to it. But I think we try to approach it as like a dialogue. I understand that some people have strong opinions, and sometimes it can give value. I don't try to just point them at our repo and say that you have to do this or anything like that. I definitely want to build a dialogue with teams. I think they like being heard, even if what they're doing might not be same.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Yeah, down here.
What were some of the common objections to adopting this framework?
Yeah, what were some of the common objections?
Oh yeah, definitely the time. I think there's the weird. I was a systems person, so the programmers were a new thing to me, and I definitely noticed that it's like they're not necessarily interested in putting the cognitive load and effort into doing something like that if they don't see an immediate value to them personally. And sometimes they're so busy with their project they don't it's either a balance of they don't necessarily see that they have enough time or they'll get enough value out of it to do it, or they don't know how to do the implementation over, so the framework on top of OpenSumTree is a big step for them. Those are probably the two biggest pushbacks.